Hotep, it's your brother Beniti. I'm in Ray. What I kind of wanted to talk about a little bit on this class here. Something we went over on the radio show this past Thursday night. We were doing a series recently on darker forms of spirituality when dealing with African sciences or spirituality, and working with the spirits of the dead to kind of dispel some of the misconceptions on that. Now, kind of the the dark energy aspect of it that we talk a lot about, black magic, and as we've dispelled the myths on that, just to make it crystal clear, when we say black magic again, for maybe newer listeners that are not familiar with this topic and have a preconceived notion of what that is, because when most people hear that term, they automatically get a definition in their mind of satanic worship and slitting the throat of animals and blood sacrifices. That's a European aspect of what they have defined, or what people know in mainstream as black magic, which automatically gets classified with Satanism or cult worship. We ain't talking about that type of black magic, because that's a bunch of garbage. We're talking about true manipulation of the subconscious mind and being able to tap into your subjective realm and then blend that and balance that out with your objective realm, which that becomes the key, and that becomes the challenge when working greater black magic. Now, the key here is when working with the spirits of the dead. When we term that word "dead," again, some people can get the definition of something grim or negative, or because the word death is automatically associated with something negative. That's not what it means. Death actually is the doorway to eternal life. So when you're working with the spirits of the dead, you're working with higher forms of your superconscious and being able to tap into these varying different energies that we call spirits. Now, as I've always said, a key to really understanding that concept, if you really take the time to study the seven hermetic principles of Tahuti, the doctrine of vibration, will clarify that these are just varying degrees of vibrations or different degrees of energy that we're talking about accessing here. So even amongst the Vodun pantheon, or the Patro Lojas, which they call working with a lot of the deities of the dead, they're gateways to the higher realms, to what we call the higher world, afterlife, etc. I'm using terminology that people can grasp. The power of importance of this is real, because if one wants to really connect with their subjective realm, they have to be able to work outside of person, place, or thing. Because the problem is, when you deal with what we call lesser black magic, or even more watered down, if you call white magic, or what some people call Wicca, it's not really true magic. It's more that deals more with earth magic, and technically it isn't. It's another form of religion, and it keeps you bound to the objective realm. If one wants to truly become a master, or become God or divinity, you hear a lot of people saying in the conscious community, "I'm God," but they don't really understand what that means. Being God or a goddess, so let's not include the female in that equation. Doesn't mean just because you read a bunch of books on consciousness, or Egypt or Africa, now that all of a sudden makes you a god. That's determined by your works and your actions, not just by what you profess out of your mouth. And the problem is, even when talking about Egypt, you can go back and and really analyze, if they really read the Coming Forth by Day. That's basically a magical book of spells and incantations, and it's a higher book that works serious forms of magic. There's different aspects of magic in ancient Egypt that you don't hear people talking about, other than the fact we get historical information and intellectual information on the history But we don't really indulge into the actual practices and update those practices for 2016. Because one thing with magic and creating your own path, you can always update and change it and at need be. Because when you are creating your own spiritual path, you can add to it, change it, update it, subtract from it as need be according to your needs. That's what being a divinity is, or being a god or a deity. So when one is able to tap into their subjective realm and tap into this higher state of consciousness, one now creates their own reality. But what you have to be careful of is just when you tap into your subjective realm, okay, what might be a reality to you there may not be a reality to somebody here. So when you are tapping into your subjective realm and having experiences, you can't necessarily convince somebody all the time of it being a reality. Now this tends to happen in a lot of systems because people, for an example, join a lot of the groups and organizations, and there's usually some divine leader that's over these organizations, and they automatically accept that individual's personal experiences. Well, that's not a reality. Now, if you can relate to some of those experiences of another individual having his experiences or her experiences on a subjective realm, and there's a similarity there, then you can correlate that to your objective realm. The problem that tends to happen is, and it's the same thing with religion, they want you to accept something that they're telling you is divine that's outside of the physical realm that you haven't confirmed yet, and you won't see it until you die, called heaven. And they want you to have faith until you get to that point, and hope that when you get to that point that it becomes a reality. This is the mass confusion that tends to take place when you try to break down and establish faith, beliefs, facts, fictions, etc. It can cause a ball of confusion. But when dealing with ancient Egypt, and as I said, the coming forth by day, it basically deals with varying levels of talismans, spells, incantations, and magical formulas to access different aspects of nature, creation, and access different archetype energies or deities. We tend to sometimes look at it as a history book, and it's not a history book. Egypt is shrouded in heavy magical practices, but you don't hear nobody talking about it. Or you hear people is talking about, how great the pyramids are, etc. And that's great. But how do we take this information, as I've said a million times before, and apply it? So working with the spirits of the dead, okay? That's contacting these entities, archetypes that have transcended the physical realm and now vibrate outside of the third density existence, and they're outside of person, place, or thing. One, first and foremost, is able to access them quite simply by raising their vibration up, by raising their frequency up. And this is done through various forms of different rituals, incantations, mantras, and certain rituals that one has to put in place to summons or invoke their presence. Now, a lot of these what we call spirits of the dead, you have to make agreements or pacts with these specific spirits. And I want to clarify that because I don't want that to sound spooky, because people hear shit like that and they get spooked out. That basically means when you make an agreement, whatever particular level you might be working with this particular spirit, you have to keep your agreement. Meaning, if you're asking for a particular magical working, for an example, if you're petitioning, let's say, the Holy Death, what they call La Santa Muerte, or the Holy Death, which is basically an aspect of the Grim Reaper, as some will see that depicted as. And they say that this deity goes back to the Aztec culture as the queen of the underworld. You can even take this back to ancient Samaria when dealing with Ishtar. You can take it back to, correlate it to higher aspects of Aset or Isis. It's the feminine divine principle. You can take it back to Kalima, back in ancient India, or what we know as in the Hindu culture or pantheon. It's basically the divine feminine principle or the dark mother goddess that deals with dark energy and dark magic. So if you're petitioning this deity for an example, and I find the best way to petition these deities is not, per se for materialistic things, because you're never going to get anything out of it if that's your purpose. When you petition these deities to be, for higher states of consciousness, to understand, the universe, to understand your place in it, you tend to get an influx of blessings and consciousness and a whole different perspective and level of understanding when you petition them in that way. When you try to work with some of these deities and you're trying to do it for money and materialistic things, that's not how this works. And unfortunately, these are your people that start to work with the dark arts or dark magic or black magic, and they tend never really to get the full benefits of it because they're seeking out the mundane. And you have to liken it to the parable of Solomon in the Bible, the symbolic story. Solomon requested the wisdom first before the materialistic things, and then everything was provided to him. That is an important concept when working with any magical system, because one gets into these different forms of magic and arts for the knowledge aspect of it, for the wisdom aspect of it, for the truth aspect of it. Truth is divine when sought out and experienced, and when it becomes a divine reality to the individual experiencing it. That's the key to this. And when you understand that principle, you'll benefit from this. You don't do this shit just to be doing it, and because you think you're going to get materialistic benefits out of it. That's mundane religious bullshit, and that just doesn't work like that. That's not how this system works. One will find out when they really tap in and are really working correctly the dark black magical practices, all the materialistic or physical things or the necessities that one needs are there for that person. They're provided. You don't have to worry about focusing on money, cars, houses, and how I'm gonna pay bills and things of that nature. That path and that road is always opened when one is seeking the wisdom and the knowledge first. And that's key to understand, because when we look at it in that perspective and we address everything first from the spiritual, because as I said before, everything has root in the spiritual. Before you can attack it and address it physically, you need to look at the essence of the origin of how that manifested from the spiritual into the physical. When you look at things in that perspective, you'll get solutions to every aspect that you're looking for, or what you're trying to do, or what you're trying to accomplish. But when you attack it just physically head on, and you're dealing with raw emotion and you're becoming reactionary, you never get the correct solution. It never works out. And these would define your people who seem to get into these practices and say that they don't have no success, because it's the intent that drives the magical working that is critical. That is the most important point. What is the intent behind the magical working? That's what you need to ask yourself. So I want you to manifest, I want you to marinate on that. Think about that. So I'm going to leave you with a little bit to think about on that subject, and kind of put it into perspective. But when you really work these higher sciences of petitioning the spirits of the dead, and again, this could be an ancestor. This could be, a particular relative that would also fit into this realm. Learning to contact and access them is key. Is very important. So it could start there. So when you understand again how this works in routine, we're going to talk about that a little bit.